So a little midnight Canon surprise, we've got the RF 28 70mm F2.8 IS STM dropped last night. Let's get right into some of the positives, negatives, unknowns, some pricing. I've got some notes here. First, obviously non-L lens, but there is weather sealing. I think this is probably dead on arrival at this price if there was no weather sealing. Normally I would say this is a little bit strange, but we do have some recent precedent for this. Well, I don't know if I'd call the 200 to 800 recent precedent anymore. It's been out for a long time and it's still difficult to get. But this is also a non-L quality lens with, I assume, fairly generous weather sealing. So to get that here in the 28 to 70 is going to make this just a pretty excellent travel lens, particularly at this size and weight. We've seen a lot of this from Canon in the RF lineup where they repeat design language across different lenses. This is actually fairly similar to the 24 to 105 f4 to 7.1. Slightly bigger, I think, if you look at the individual specs, but much closer in size to this than something like the 24 to 105 f4L. So that's pretty encouraging, and you're getting that constant f2.8, which I think a lot of people are going to be looking for. And unless I'm missing something, I think this is the first example of something that's, relatively affordable on the RF line that is a constant aperture zoom lens. Seemingly a lot to like here at the start. However, I think, looking at some of the negatives, this gap where you have to zoom to even start using the lens at 28, I hate that. I haven't used it, but I really don't like that design choice. I think that makes this lens feel cheap. I think that is probably annoying in the field. I could be wrong. I think they have one other lens like this. It might be the affordable 24 to 50. I think this is the lens that also does that. So the 24 to 50, I think you got to spin it to start. And I just really, really don't like that choice. But because this lens has already existed, that choice isn't super surprising here. It is surprising to see it on what should be that elevated quality, though not L, that elevated quality lens. So we'll see. If you have used this 24 to 50, let me know how annoying that feature is, because I don't have a concept of that yet. The f2.8 is definitely not a negative per se, but I think this is not a lens that I would look at for creating really gorgeous background blur. The jump from f4 to f2.8 gives you some leeway with shutter speed and light. I think the jump, at least in this focal range, the jump from f2.8 to something faster like 1.8 is where you start to see some of that really great separation. So not a complete stunner here, but I think this will be much appreciated by many. The massive negative here, and it's not even for this lens in particular, I think it's for the broader RF lineup in the future to come, is that because Canon will reuse this design language, and that's become a theme on this RF lineup, I think we can expect a lot of these types of lenses. Non-L, that might still be weather dust resistant. They're going to have maybe some compromise on the focal range. So here I think you would say that, not going to 24 is how they make this cheaper than the Trinity lens, for example, how they make it smaller, all those things. Maybe you see some compromises around aperture. So like darker lenses maybe than we're typically used to. And we're going to see all of those lenses come out, trickle out at Canon speed, likely. And I would doubt that third-party full-frame lenses come online before Canon thinks they've fleshed out what we can call maybe this new line of non-L weather-sealed lenses. I don't know any more than you do. That's my guess. I don't feel great about that. And not even from the standpoint that it's too expensive. We can get to why I think this is probably, appropriately priced in a second, but I think it just indicates that we're still not going to get that choice for a really long time, if ever. If you're one of those people that's been dying to see third-party full frame, I think you've got a while more to wait, potentially. A few unknowns, I think, that will probably need some time to figure out. How good is the image quality wide open? Just like where does it fall on the line between something like the 24 to 105 STM and something like the 24 to 70 Trinity lens? Frankly, I've used this lens. I have a comparison between this 24 to 105 and the 24 to 105 that I have. When you stop this down for something like landscape, it's not all that noticeable, at least on something like the R6 sensor. So that like lower megapixel body, you probably start to notice on something like the R5, maybe the R7. Can't really speak to that too much. This lens, I assume, is similar, but hoping there's pretty good performance wide open at f2.8 throughout the zoom range. Otherwise, this is going to be a little bit disappointing. It will be interesting to see how the corners look on this lens, and particularly if you're going to use this at 28 mil wide open for dabbling in astro. I've used that 28 pancake for astro at f2.8. Works really well. If this lens doesn't really perform in the corners for something like that, that will be disappointing as well, I think, because part of the allure, if you purchase this as a travel lens, is that you could use that in those circumstances when traveling. And then lastly, how does this get offered? It would be really interesting to see this paired as a kit lens with the R8, maybe even something like the R6 II. If it's intended to be a part of one of those packages, that might bode well for availability. If nothing else, like if not new, particularly for the secondhand market at some point in the future. Checking my notes, back to the pricing here. This is why I don't think this is super wild. So we have just a ton of examples of lenses that are sort of in this neighborhood that also make like one of those compromises on either the zoom range or the aperture. Pretty nice zoom range here, but it's an f4, right? Much shorter zoom range here, but an f2.8. This lens, comparable price, much different range here, notably going 4 millimeters wider, which is a big difference between 28 and 24, if you are familiar with that. Another sort of take on Sony's design language there, short zoom range, but giving you that constant f2.8. Again, a little bit more expensive. And you have a few more affordable third-party offerings depending on the lens characteristics. Can't speak to how these lenses work. I just know like this is sort of the plethora of choice that I think people are sort of hankering for when they've been on the Canon RF ecosystem for years at this point. We've got some EF options. Obviously, this lens shares the same focal range. Sort of ironically, that's maybe where the similarities end. This is a good bit brighter, massive, and super expensive. So you're probably, despite that focal range being exactly the same, you're probably not choosing between those two lenses. Some people might actually end up with both if you already own this and love the range, but need something smaller. And then part of the pricing strategy on the 28-70 is obviously not to cannibalize too much with lenses that share maybe similar use cases. Darker aperture here, much more usable zoom range. Obviously, this is coming as a kit lens with many bodies. A little bit more expensive if you buy it unpackaged. But this lens, as compared to the 28-70, probably creates a pretty tough choice for some people, I think, if they own neither to start. And then obviously, some people might be comparing the 24-70 f2.8 with this 28-70. But again, pretty big price difference. So if you are kind of on the fence comparing those, I think you're someone who's probably also maybe debating how much to spend on a body upgrade at the same time. And that's probably a tough call. I think this really depends on how much you want to use that 24-28. And it's going to depend on how the quality looks coming out of the 28-70 when we get to see a lot more people get their hands on it. If you're new to this channel, I'm Dan. I'm somewhat of an aspiring travel photographer myself. I have lots of existing videos on the f4 zooms that I love for travel that you might want to check out, most recently in New Zealand. Otherwise, I've technically crashed my own podcast to talk about this lens a little bit more like a video. At this point, we're going to roll into some of my more normal Upload Iceberg episode 17 topics. We're going to look at my upcoming rental. We're going to look at my remaining video roadmap for 2024, or at least the hopeful roadmap. I've been moving quite slow. And as always, some channel analytics. Now, before we get to the rental, and speaking of new stuff, big shout out to Peak Design here today. I'm not sure if you know this about me, but I can't resist a great bag. My brain can't get enough of that little organizational hit that a nice bag provides when traveling. And while I have several that work really well for me, I still was pretty short on space when it came to packing up my clothes and miscellaneous gear for extended driving trips. I've been known recently for some extended stays in Colorado. That's what I'm doing right now here. And Peak Design sent me these 2 bags for the trip. I'm not exactly sure how I've been living out of suitcases in the past for extended periods without a tech pouch, but their small one has been lovely. I'm not new to Peak Design. I like the ecosystem a lot. And this material reminds me exactly of the f-stop diamond material and zippers that you'd find on the Ajna that I already love. And then you can listen to more about how I packed for New Zealand in a previous episode. I love my Patagonia bag for travel, but like I said, super excited to add this one because obviously one carry-on size bag isn't cutting it when you're driving a ton of your stuff cross country. It's a great complementary bag for me because you still have a ton of organization and pockets here, but I was missing that big open pocket as well. I packed a ton of seasonal clothes in here for the trip. I even stuffed my Rodecaster Duo and it inherently has great structure for a duffel, and I love that. These are going to get a great workout here while I'm out west. I'm actually headed to Utah next week as part of this trip, so stay tuned for how they're holding up. Now, out of all the options to rent, why the 50mm f1.2? Because previously I've talked about renting a lot. I've considered renting an entire new camera system this year, particularly for this trip. I'm not going to do that at the moment. I wanted to rent the 15-35 or maybe the equivalent on any other camera system, as that's a lens I think is maybe one of the fast zooms that would fit in my bag well long term. I've talked obviously about renting the 100-500. If you've seen how much I've used the 100-400 in the past, I have that on this trip, so I will be using at least the 100-400. I've also wanted to try traveling with the 24-70 or other manufacturers' equivalent just to see how I like that, to compare the size and quality, as I often use my 24-105 on trips like this. Perhaps most recently on this channel, I've talked about renting the RF 35. I wanted to get a good feel for this form factor, as we know, or at least we're pretty sure, that Canon's going to release a 24, a 50, and potentially even other focal lengths in this form factor in the future. This is still a little bit tricky to get. I wanted to rent something for a pretty sizable amount of time to get a good feel, sort of like I did with the R7. So this is still a little bit tricky to get. I decided to skip on that for the moment. And so sort of in the same way that I'd like to try a Trinity lens, I've wanted to try another of Canon's flagship primes. I don't think this is a lens that I will end up buying, at least not anytime soon. I'm really interested in something a little bit smaller, typically for hiking, but we are going to throw this right into the capture clip and get after it regardless. I have rented both 85 primes in the past, and that was sort of a disappointing rental period, not because of the gear itself, but because I just separated my shoulder playing hockey, could barely even lift or put on my camera bag. So grabbing some of the two heftiest primes and attempting to compare them side by side was quite the task for me physically at the time. So I'm excited to get my hands on this one. My nifty 50 I have out on long-term loan, so it'll be good to replace a 50 in my bag for a month. And I want to test some hypotheses around, how much do I truly love the 50? Do I like this better than 85 truly? I typically will use the 85 outside, but when I use it inside, it always feels too tight. So maybe long-term, this is something more fitting. Also, my 85 is the Samyang Rokinon 85, and I don't even have the firmware on my R6 up to date, because if you bring it past, I forget what the firmware version is, if you bring it past a certain level, that lens loses some functionality, I think, in high-speed shooting. In any future firmware, it could go completely offline. So while I really like that lens and I like the weight and I like it for hiking, I don't really consider that a super long-term piece of my bag, just because any firmware could render that essentially useless. Or it might not work in my next Canon body if I go that route. And then the other thing I wanted to do by getting a prime is just to be a little bit more stylistic in my shooting for these next few months. If you watched any of my New Zealand content, I packed for coverage there. And if we go back even a little further, one of my frustrations shooting last year was that I feel like I'm not making good progress on developing a style, kind of like, breaking out of my current skill level, I guess. Brought zooms to New Zealand sort of out of fear. Out of coverage, but sort of out of fear. I debated briefly just bringing kind of 28, 85, 100-400. And so just going to kind of embrace that mainly prime shooting here for the next couple months. I'll be outdoors, I'll be with friends. I think I'm just going to enjoy the wide open aperture and see if this form factor is truly a deal breaker for me long term, as I suspected it might be. Maybe it's not. It'll be interesting to see how well this does as a two lens combo, right? 50mm and the 24-105. Is that hikeable for stuff that's more intense for me? Who knows? Maybe. We'll see. I've been slacking. Not actually slacking, just not doing a lot of photography in YouTube, at least not on the photo channel. So here's the ambitious 5-video 2024 plan. Number 1, the RF 50-1.2. What's the quality like? I can tell you, it's heavy. Does that form factor suck for travel? Could I use it with the 24-105 as a 2-lens travel combo? Video number 2, something like primes out west, focusing on this 50 that I have for about a month, a 28mm, the Sigma that I have, and probably the 85. At some point earlier in the year, I wanted to do primes only in New Zealand, maybe with the 100-400, but got cold feet on that, got pretty nervous. This is a much lower stakes trip, so I'm going to try that out here, at least a little bit more than I would normally. Number 3 and 4, related Lightroom editing videos for both the 50mm video and the prime video. Kind of low key, we'll see how the structure of those will go, but I'm frustrated with how the Milky Way Lightroom video did. And like I said, I want to get right back on that horse, see if I can make those something that are worth watching. And then number 5, a thought out narrative video. Something in depth like my New Zealand zooms. Don't really know the topic yet, but we'll see how that goes. Given how slowly I put stuff out, that's ambitious for the next 3.5 months, but we'll see how it goes. Let's give it a shot.